All right, it's a few moments after 6, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar on fall planting for pollinators. This is our 8th webinar this summer, and so we're excited to keep them going and hopefully provide you some really great information tonight. My name is Michaela Richardson, and I will be facilitating the webinar. I am the Big Sky Watershed Corps member for the Flathead Conservation District. Before diving into the webinar, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items for Zoom and then do introductions of our presenters. So to start, please keep yourself muted at all times unless you are speaking. This will just help prevent any background noise. And I'm also able to mute you on my end if you can't find the mute button, which is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Another thing to take note, up in the upper right-hand corner is a button called Speaker View. You can toggle between Speaker View and Gallery View. This will allow you to only see the speaker talking, and this can really help when we get the presentation up. It just helps it be a little less distracting so you don't have to see everybody else who's on the call. Additionally, as we go through the presentation, we may mention different resources or websites, and I will be posting those in the chat box at the bottom to allow you to access those links to go to those different resources. Some of these resources will also be PDFs that you will be able to download onto your computer as well. This webinar is also being recorded, and so this recording with the video and additional resources will also be available on our website within a few days. And so that's about it for Zoom housekeeping. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters tonight. We will have Samantha Tappenbeck. She is the Conservation Programs Manager, given a wave there on the screen. She will be starting the presentation, and then the second half will be done by Haley Graff, who is our Resource Conservationist for the Flathead Conservation District. And she will be leading the second half. And I just got a message that someone can't hear me. How is my audio? Can I get a thumbs up? Is it okay? All right. If it's not working, I'll try signing in and back out and then back into the meeting if you can't hear me at all. All right. So the webinar outline. The presentations are going to last about 45 minutes to an hour. And then after that, we will have an open discussion and a Q&A session afterwards. If you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to post that into the chat box. And as soon as we start that discussion session, we will address those questions first. And then during the questions, you can either post in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. There's a nifty little hand raising feature if you go under participants, which is a great way to use when we're in that discussion session. And then also at the very end, I'll remind us a few more times, but we have a survey that we would love if you could take the time to fill out at the very end. It'll take no more than 2 or 3 moments of your time. We highly encourage you to fill it out. We want to hear from you so we can improve these kinds of events in the future. And then also so we can report and track what participants have learned, as a lot of these webinars are funded through grants. And so we like to be able to report on how everyone's doing and what they've learned through our webinars. And further, I think that's all I have right now. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Samantha.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me while I get set up here. All right, how does that look, Michaela? All right, well, thanks again so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you guys about fall seeding and planting. So in this webinar, we are going to focus on the characteristics, methods, and strategies associated with seeding and planting in the fall. So the specific details for seeding and planting work in the fall that you are interested in will depend a lot on what you want to plant. So for example, you might be interested in developing pollinator habitat on your property. Well, both native wildflowers and native grasses are excellent pollinator habitat. And so you may use various strategies or a combination of strategies to establish that habitat. But generally speaking, fall can be one of the best times to establish native vegetation in Montana. In this webinar, we'll cover the basics of both seeding and planting strategies during the fall. I'm going to talk about seeding. So I'll go over some of the benefits, some of the differences in strategies that you might use, the importance of timing considerations, and then importance of site preparation and what factors you might consider when going through site preparation, seeding methods and tips, and then what you'll expect for your seeding. What will it look like once you get it done, and how will it look into the future? And then we'll talk about some relevant programs and resources, and the planting discussion that Haley's going to cover is pretty much going to follow the same outline. So we'll go ahead and jump in to some of the benefits of fall seeding. So when it comes to seeding in the fall, there's a lot of benefits. And if you sow seeds with high dormancy in the fall, the cold temperatures and the freeze-thaw cycle that occur throughout the fall and the winter, they can help to break the dormancy of those seeds at the right time. So not only exposure to like the freeze-thaw and the cold itself, but also the moist cold conditions can help to scarify or stratify the seed. It's basically kind of breaking down the coating on that seed and then the inhibitors to germination for that seed. So those are characteristic of seeds with high dormancy. They have those inhibitors, but the fall and winter conditions can help break those down. So the freeze-thaw cycle of the soil, and then also the pressure of overlying snow throughout the winter can help create better seed to soil contact, which is really critical. You've got to get seeds in contact with the soil in order to get past those germination inhibitors and trigger that germination when the time comes. Seeding in the fall also allows seeds to take advantage of early spring moisture. So it's a good strategy in areas where irrigation is not available. It allows for earlier germination in seasons when spring seeding would be difficult due to mud. So if you're not able to actually access the site early enough in the spring, you'll be able to essentially see earlier germination because your seeds are already in place from that dormant seeding. Certain soil conditions also benefit from fall seeding because certain soil types like sandy soils, they dry out really quickly in the spring. So if you seed it in the spring, you may miss that first initial period of moisture in sandy soils. But if you got those seeds down in the fall, then they'll have the advantage of that spring moisture from precipitation and from snow melt when the time comes. Clay soils, on the other hand, are very difficult to work in the spring. So it's better to do site prep in the fall. You can do weed spraying and tilling and all of that in the fall in clay soils and do a dormant seeding, and that can be really beneficial because those clay soils are more susceptible to degradation in that early spring time period when conditions are super moist. So, you know, really the benefit of fall seeding is that it allows you to mimic the natural processes that occur in nature. So you take advantage of those environmental conditions and the plant adaptations themselves that are adapted to the environmental conditions. So it's an imitation of nature. So again, you'd expect earlier germination in the spring. Seed is set earlier than you would otherwise be able to access the site in the spring to get those seeds down. So that's a big benefit. All right. So there's a couple of different seeding strategies you might use when it comes to fall seeding. So the seeding strategy that you select should account for the adaptations of the plants that you want to seed. And so there are 4 functional plant groups, generally speaking. There are cool season grasses, cool season broadleaf plants, and then there are warm season grasses and warm season broadleaf plants. So cool season vegetation is adapted to growing in cooler conditions. Warm season is just the opposite. It's adapted to growing in warm season. So they each have different triggers that you want to consider when you're planning out what kind of seeding you're going to do. So you might use a late seeding approach. So in this situation, cool season species can germinate at lower soil temperatures and at lower air temperatures. So they don't need that warm weather to trigger germination. They can tolerate soil temperatures down like between 50 and 65 degrees, and air temperatures from like 60 to 75 degrees are ideal for those cool season species. So germination and growth in early fall is then followed by a period of plant dormancy. So those little seedlings that came up from your late season seeding, they grow a little bit and then they stop growing. Then they go into dormancy and they're conserving energy that they produced during the growing season in the form of carbohydrates and sugars. And then they use strategies that they are adapted for to protect the soft tissue that they grew during the growing season. So then in the spring, they break their dormancy and resume growth once the conditions are favorable. A dormant seeding, on the other hand, is just putting seeds down during a dormancy period. So you don't expect germination here. So the seed dormancy is the inability of viable seeds to germinate under favorable conditions. So it's an evolved trait that essentially allows a plant species to hedge its bets. And so it allows some seeds to survive conditions and seasons that are unfavorable for growth and remain viable and wait another year until those conditions are better for growth. So for example, some seeds may germinate right away, but will perish if there's drought conditions. Not enough moisture, they didn't make it, they perish. Dormant seeds, on the other hand, that did not germinate, they'll be preserved for another season that hopefully will have more favorable growing conditions. So a dormant seeding, you are not expecting germination in the fall. You're putting it down so that it's ready for germination come spring and those favorable conditions. So in your planning, you want to consider timing. Timing relates to a number of factors. What are you planning to seed? What are your local climate conditions? Spring is often thought of as the best time to plant seed, but when you're seeding native plants and wildflowers, fall is generally the best around here in Montana. So when dormant seeding in the fall, air and soil temperatures are too low for germination, so the seed will remain in the soil all winter long to then germinate in the spring. Many of our native species require a soil temperature of 60 to 70 degrees for those seeds to germinate. And so in most areas, germination will not occur early and mid-fall. They'll hold off until spring. So dormant seeding is conducted typically after several freezes, but before there is a lot of snow cover. So the seeds then lie dormant in the soil until spring when warmer temperatures and moisture are available. And the specific timing of your dormant seeding depends on the weather. But generally speaking, be prepared to seed after the first killing frost, but before there's more than just a light snow. And around here, that's usually late September through December. It just depends on the snow conditions that year. We got some local guidance from the CHS agronomy department, and they recommend seeding native grasses the week prior to Thanksgiving. In their experience, that's the sweet spot between the killing frost and too much snow on the ground. All right. So you can look up for the area that you are planning to seed when you would expect to see the first frost of the season and when you would expect to see the last frost of the season. So I just looked this up for our zip code, and there are some differences in frosts, and we won't get too deep into the weeds here, but a light frost is just where temperatures drop to like just below freezing for a few hours. Some hardy plants can survive this and they're not damaged. A hard frost or a killing frost is where temperatures drop below 28 degrees for a longer time. So it'll kill the top growth, it'll kill that above ground biomass for most perennials and root crops. So that's the big freeze. And so you can look up, for your area what probability there is of seeing those different levels of frost by date throughout the year. But it's of course different every year, especially here in Northwest Montana. So when you're selecting, and preparing your site, there are many factors to consider. And what you'll find is that often your site selection is a compromise between the ideal and the practical. So you want to do some planning. That's a critical first step. You want to brainstorm, research, and develop a plan for what you want to do. So identify your goals for your property. Do you want to improve habitat for native pollinators? Do you want to feed your apiary, or do you want to attract pollinators to your vegetable garden and your orchard? Do you want to establish a native grass meadow or a no-mow lawn? So consider what your goals are for your property. And then do your research. So identify the resources that you need in order to reach those goals. And just as a quick side note here, if you are interested in improving pollinator habitat on your property, we had another webinar that we did earlier this summer called DIY Pollinator Habitat, and you can find the recording for that on our website if you want to check that out. It's got a lot of great, more general information about the benefits and details of providing pollinator habitat. But another factor that you want to consider is budget. It'll cost you both money and time to make changes on your property. So you want to factor that in as you're setting realistic goals for yourself. So that budget should be considered over the short term and the long term. There will be some expenses for doing the proper site preparation, and then it'll also cost you time. So take a look at your property, ask yourself what you have. What does it offer in terms of plant communities? What do you have for topography on your property? Are there areas of steep slopes or a more gentle slope? What about soil moisture or certain soil conditions across your property? So consider those sorts of things when you just kind of give some general thought and take an overview of your property, and then try sketching it out. Identify those areas with good foraging plants or potential nesting sites for pollinators, and then look at the land in between those areas. So if it has little habitat value currently, this could be a good location to seed a pollinator plot and develop habitat. So you don't want to totally change an area that's already serving a purpose and providing a good habitat. So that's the advantage to kind of giving an overview or doing an overview of your property and seeing what you have and where you might fill in the gaps. So in selecting your site, like for example, for a pollinator plot, consider that habitat patches that are bigger, rounder and closer to other patches are generally better than smaller, uneven shapes that are more isolated from one another. That's just generally speaking, but that's some guidance you could go on. Does it have good sun exposure? You want full sun for at least part of the day and mostly open. It's good for photosynthesizing plants, of course, but it's also good for insects because insects actually lose a lot of body heat as they travel around. And so giving them good sun exposure keeps them happy. And then also they need to see the open sky in order to navigate. So a few considerations for the users of your habitat. What kind of vegetation is currently growing on the site? And how will that vegetation impact and compete with your seeding? Weeds are aggressive competitors and will need to be treated prior to seeding. Another factor is the area to edge ratio for the area that you're looking to seed. If you maximize that, so you increase your area to perimeter edge ratio, then that'll limit encroachment by weeds, so they have less of a potential of finding their way in with a smaller perimeter and a larger area on the inside. And it can limit the negative effects of adjacent land management practices if applicable. So is the area that you're looking to seed adjacent to agricultural fields that might be applying insecticides? If that's the case, you want to provide a spatial buffer between where you're doing your seeding and the area that they're going to be doing a chemical application. So we have some guidance on that, and I believe Michaela will share a resource that we have available. This is from the Xerces Society, and it is a guide to establishing pollinator buffers based on the type of chemical application that might be going on an adjacent property. All right, so when it comes to preparing your seed bed, seeding wildflower seeds for pollinator habitat requires diligent site preparation to reduce weed pressure, because when the wildflowers begin to germinate in the spring, weed control options are very limited. So you need to have a clean, weed-free seed bed to ensure the success of your seeding. It's really important. So the methods that you use for site preparation and treatment of that vegetation that's there will vary a lot depending on what existing vegetation is there. And so in areas with infestations of noxious weeds, that might require multiple seasons or even years of persistent treatments and control. So when you're selecting a method, consider these factors. Some possible methods that you might use for site preparation, let's say you're doing a pollinator plot, you could use a chemical application like a broad spectrum herbicide like glyphosate, Roundup, and then combine that with tillage. So if you go for that, then you want to consider how much time that would take prior to your seeding. So you might do a chemical application, wait 10 days, till it, wait another 2 weeks to see if anything regenerates, hit it again with a chemical application, and then wait for a few days before you actually do your seeding. That tends to be the most effective treatment for existing vegetation and noxious weeds. There are other options. You might choose to use tillage only. So in this case, you want to burn the area or mow it down. Get that vegetation as low as possible before you till, and then till it, wait for 10 to 14 days, till it again, and then wait for another 10 to 14 days before you do your seeding. The more times you can repeat that tillage cycle, the better, because every time you're going to bring up some more weed seeds every time you do a till. Another option is a process called solarization. So that process uses the power of the sun to essentially kill out weed seeds, existing vegetation, and even some disease and parasites in the first 1 to 3-ish inches of soil. And the way it works is that you cut down the existing vegetation as low as possible. You mow it down real low, or you burn it, or even till it if you can. You then wet it down on that area, and then you lay down a UV resistant clear plastic tarp, and you seal the edges of it. And then you allow that tarp to stay in place for at least 60 days during the hottest period of the year. So generally June through August. If you can maximize that amount of time so that you're taking advantage of the hottest days for the longest amount of time, you're going to get the best effects. And essentially what that does, again, is just kill out those seeds and potential competitors in the first few inches of soil. So once you complete the solarization process, you remove that tarp, and it's not a permanent fix. You don't want to till that area again, because again, you've just treated the first few inches of soil. And so consider that, but it should be ready to seed, and it'll essentially give those seeds a leg up over any potential competitors. So we have those steps that I just described outlined in a planting guide that we have available through one of our programs, and Michaela will provide that to you guys now. That's our pollinator planting guide. So it describes those various considerations for selecting a site, treating the site, and preparing that area for a seeding. So once you have prepared your site and you have a clean, weed-free seed bed, you are ready for seeding. But before we move on to seeding tips and methods, I want to just discuss briefly an alternative method of site preparation that you might consider for use this fall. So cover crops can be sown in the fall for the protection and enrichment of the soil, and to prepare the soil for seeding in the spring. So this would be fall seeding of your cover crop. And these crops are not for us, they're not cash crops, they are for the soil. And you can think of them as a living mulch. They armor the soil, they suppress weeds, they control erosion, and they lock in soil moisture. So they provide lots of essential contributions to the soil food web, which really boosts your soil health. They help build soil aggregates, and they open up pore spaces so that the vegetation that you want growing there can more effectively penetrate into the soil, and they improve infiltration. And they also provide great pollinator food and habitat. There's lots of different types. There are lots of varieties of cover crops, and in turn, there are many different services that they provide. So some of them are nitrogen fixers. They can add nutrients to your soil. Some of them are biomass producers, and they'll provide organic matter to your soil. Some are compaction breakers. They bust up that compacted soil at the surface. And some are great erosion control. So there are many considerations when it comes to selecting a cover crop for you. There's considerations such as timing, what function they serve, what varieties you want to sow together, what is the expense, and then what termination will you use for your cover crop. This is essentially, this is your fall seeding potentially, and so once spring comes around, you potentially want to terminate that cover crop and sow in your cash crop or your vegetable garden. So you want to consider timing. When do you plan to sow a cover crop? That's going to tell you if you want to use a cool season or a warm season crop. Annuals tend to be seeded earlier than perennial crops, so they have time to grow before that killing frost sets in. Perennial cover crops can be planted later in the season. They tend to be those cold weather species that are adapted to growing in cooler temperatures. So they begin growing earlier, they go dormant, and you can sow them up until the fall, and then they start regrowing again in the spring. So how will you terminate the crop? There are winter kill crops. which are killed out, just like it sounds, in the wintertime. So they'll grow a little bit in the fall, but then they'll die once that first frost hits. But they'll leave you really good organic matter in the soil come the spring because you leave them in place. And because those roots are still in place, even though they're not a living, growing plant anymore, they provide really good erosion control and they help stabilize that soil. So some common winter kill crops that you might consider for cover are buckwheat, annual rye, crimson clover, oats, field peas, oilseed radish, and rapeseed. And then there are winter hardy varieties. So they'll survive the winter, they'll then resume growth in the spring, and they tend to be perennial. So they'll, whoops, sorry about that. So yeah, our winter crops, they will resume growth in the spring. And these are great for areas that you don't want to plant immediately come spring, as their growth will stabilize the soil, they'll outcompete weed seeds, and they'll keep the soil covered and limit erosion. So some common species you might choose here are winter rye. That's a really good one for controlling erosion. Hairy vetch, which makes great pollinator forage early season. Medium red clover, winter wheat, and sometimes crimson clover. But you want to consider termination for those. And one method is that you can mow those close to the ground 2 to 3 weeks prior to planting your cash crop. So you also want to consider your budget with cover crops. Of course, these aren't your cash crops. So they're more like an investment in your soil health, in your weed control, but they are not what you'll harvest come fall. Right. So when it comes to doing your actual seeding, you want to consider, okay, so what are you going to put down in the fall in Northwest Montana? So cold season grasses, native grasses are great options. And then you want to use wildflowers that have high dormancy rates. So how do you actually go about spreading your seed? There are different methods depending on the size of the area that you want to seed. So generally, broadcast seeding is very effective. That consists of just scattering seed onto the soil surface. It's low tech, it's low cost, and it's really effective on bare soil. So you can just do hand broadcasting if you're seeding a small site. But if you are broadcasting a larger area, you might consider using drop seeders or fertilizer spreaders. And there are other little crafty inventions that people have made up for broadcasting seed using like a hand crank unit. But when you're broadcast seeding, you want to mix the seed with an equal or greater volume of slightly damp inert materials, such as coarse sand, vermiculite, rice hulls, or sawdust. And that inert material is going to help provide proper species distribution for your seed mix. And then it also gives you a visual representation of how evenly the seed mix is being spread across the planting area. So following that seeding, you want to do just a light raking or harrowing. You also potentially do a light mulching, super light. This is just to prevent erosion, help lock in that good soil moisture. If you're doing a dormant seeding, irrigation is not going to be necessary. You're going to be able to take advantage of that early spring moisture. Later on in the season, if you want to do frequent light irrigations, that can help to give your seeds a boost, but it shouldn't be necessary most of the time. Fertilizer is also not necessary. So there's a really nice guide to establishing pollinator meadows from the Xerces Society that kind of provides an overview of many of these things: site selection and preparation, different methods for doing your broadcast seeding and how to prepare the seed mix. So Michaela's going to share with you guys that resource. You can check it out. So what do we expect from our fall seeding? Germination will occur as soon as soil temperatures are appropriate. So expect earlier germination than if you were to seed in spring. The seeds are already in place and in contact with the soil. They've got good soil contact. And that is, prior to your ability to access the area during most years. So there's a lot of mud, potentially a lot of snow cover still, but having those seeds in place from your fall seeding, they're already there. Note that many perennial wildflower seeds germinate slowly and may take several seasons to germinate. So they hedge their bets, right? So the composition of your plant community from your seeding, it might vary over time. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the natural process. Your maintenance needs will vary over time as well. In the first spring after a fall seeding, the site might become dominated by annual and biannual weeds. So if you seeded a pollinator plot and your seed mix is mostly hardy perennials, then periodic mowing during the first year will prevent short-lived weeds from producing more seed and allow sunlight to reach the natives. So generally, those perennial species are unharmed by the mowing, so that's a good approach. If your mix is mostly annuals, on the other hand, mow once late in the season, once the flowers are long done blooming, and your mowing can then help to effectively scatter those dry seed heads. So again, irrigation should not be necessary because you get that good spring moisture from precip and snow melt. But frequent light irrigations once things start to dry out might help give it a boost. So the Flathead Pollinator Initiative is a program that we rolled out this year, and we cooperated with some of our neighboring conservation districts in Northwest Montana when we rolled out this program. And the program provides free wildflower seed to landowners that are interested in improving pollinator habitat on their properties. So we can provide the seed and some technical assistance on site selection, site preparation, seeding, and monitoring. And what we ask is that landowners commit to doing the proper site preparation and maintenance over time, and that they also agree to let us monitor the plot over time. We'd like to track the progress and how things are going. But the seed mix that we offer through the Flathead Pollinator Initiative, it is a mix of mostly native flowering forb and legume species. And they provide flowers of different shapes, sizes, heights, colors, and bloom times so that you attract a wide variety of pollinators and ensure that they have a good source of food and forage all season long. So if you are interested in participating in that program, it's essentially a first come, first serve program. So this year we have about an acre's worth of seed. We give out a max of 2,500 square feet to individual landowners. And like I said, it's first come, first serve, but we do plan on continuing this program into the future. So if you're interested, you can check out our webpage, which Michaela will provide a link to in the chat box. And we'd be happy to talk more details with you about that program. So we at Flathead Conservation District also worked with the Natural Resources Conservation Service and CHS to develop some native grass seed mixes that are actually available for purchase at CHS here in Kalispell. So if you're interested in seeding native grasses, we have a few options available. There's 3 different mixes. The Valley mix is more appropriate for like open, more sunnier areas that you might find here in the Flathead Valley. There's also a forest mix, and that's appropriate for, like you might expect, more forested areas, a little more shade. It's a different species composition. There's also a reclamation mix that is most appropriate for areas that have been really heavily disturbed and you're trying to restore that area to a native grass mix. And so I won't go through the details of each of those seed mixes, but the species and their relative abundance is listed here. You can also check out our website for additional information about these seed mixes and how you can go about purchasing them. And Michaela will provide the link to that webpage in the chat box as well. All right. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Haley, who's going to talk about fall planting.
Okay, great. Thanks, Samantha. I'll have you stop sharing your screen and I will share mine.
All right. Whoops. Almost there. Here we go.
Great. Okay. All right, can everybody see the screen? Okay, great. Well, so now we're going to jump into talking about containerized plantings that you would maybe pick up at a nursery, as opposed to what Samantha has just gone over, which is most of your seeding. So a lot of people, when we talk about pollinators, tend to think about wildflowers. But a lot of our pollinators also need woody vegetation for nesting and their overwintering habitat. So some of what I'm going to talk about is applicable to flowering shrubs, flowering trees, things like that. But remember that we're also talking about all the other shrubs and trees that you would plant that provide other woody biomass and leaf litter and things like that that are important for the other seasons for our pollinators. So when we talk about providing habitat for our pollinators, we need to talk about more than just flowers. We need to talk about the other characteristics and the other items that they need. The flowers provide forage for our pollinators in the form of pollen, and they need that, and a lot of our pollinators need to collect that pollen. The bees need to bring it back to their hives and store it over winter so they make it through the winter. But a lot of our native pollinators also need tree cavities, leaf litter, the hollow pith in a lot of our plants, such as some sunflowers and different things like that, are necessary for our pollinators to lay their eggs into for overwintering. So as the Xerces Society is fond of saying, leave the leaves and save the stems. So this is really in reference to what you already have going on in your garden. So you've already got some things planted, you've got some trees there. This is just a note to remember not to completely remove all those. A lot of people have a tendency in the fall to sort of clean up their garden or their yard in preparation for winter. So we very busily go about cutting down all of the stalks that are still standing, and cut down and clean up and rake under our trees. We take any brush piles and we put them in the fire pit for burning later. But that is all of the locations that our native pollinators are going to be making nests and trying to survive the winter. So learn to leave it where it is. If you have a snag in your yard, such as the one pictured here that's got great holes in it, as long as it's not going to fall in your house, consider just leaving it where it is. Learn to be okay with things being a bit messy. So that brush pile that is a remnant of all the sticks that came down in your yard, leave it leaned up against your shed, things like that. Just leave a little bit for the bees. But now let's jump into not just talking about what you already have and what to do with it, but how to create additional forage and nesting and overwintering habitat for our pollinators. And this is basically tips and tricks for fall planting to get more plants in the ground successfully. So Samantha mentioned some of these benefits already. There are a lot of carryover from seeds. We'll have a lot of the same adaptations in our mature plants, but also just a lot of the same seasonal conditions. So as Samantha has previously mentioned, in the springtime, we have a lot of clay soils, and in the spring, those soils can be very mucky and muddy and just quite frankly, very difficult to work in. So if you are doing site prep, or if you're, in this case, planting in the fall, the soil can just be easier. It's easier to drive your four-wheeler down to the site. It's easier to get your shovel in the soil, things like that. Also, our soil temps generally may remain pretty warm in the fall. Even after the air temperature has cooled down, our soil temps will generally stay warm. One of the other benefits that we'll have with a fall planting is that it can allow for better acclimation of that plant to your really specific growing location and your sort of microclimate that you have. It'll become better acclimated to that this fall, so that in the spring it can really take off running and have kind of a head start. When temperatures are lower, particularly when we get those really cold nights, those cold crisp nights, hopefully not frosting yet, my garden got hit this week, but when we have cooler temperatures, a lot of the pests and diseases are just lower in numbers. So we don't have to worry about that quite as much in the fall. But probably the biggest benefit of planting in the fall is that we are encouraging really strong root generation of all of our plants. So in the spring, if you chuck a plant in the ground, it really wants to put on a lot of foliage and leaf out and bud out, and a lot of its energy is going to that production. But in the fall, transpiration is lower in plants, and they're basically using their energy very conservatively, and they're putting it where it counts, which is that strong root generation. So this can be a great way to put something in the ground now and set it up for future success down the road. So like Samantha talked about with seeds, we've got two different strategies. We've got late season planting, and then we have also dormant season planting. So late season planting is very much what you would expect it to be. The plants are still actively growing, but it's pretty late in the year. So this can still be done because soil temperatures are still warm, like I mentioned, but the plant isn't producing nearly as much foliage as it was in early spring, and it's also not trying to produce blooms or like fruits, that sort of thing right now. So this is the strategy that you would use now up until about mid-October, when we're going to start having those killing frosts. And by then we would expect plants to naturally be going into dormancy. The one thing that you'll want to be careful of is if you purchase a plant that maybe has been grown in a nursery or in a greenhouse, if it still has some of those warmer temperatures in the greenhouse, it may not go into dormancy quite as early. So what you don't want to do is take a still actively growing plant and wait too long and put it in the ground when it should be a dormant planting. So the late season plantings, we kind of need to cut those off before the soil temperatures get below about 40 degrees. Okay. So then a dormant planting, just like Samantha talked about, is when you're planting something where it's gone dormant already. You're not expecting it to put on a lot of growth or any growth right now. It is basically you can consider it plant hibernation, right? It is waiting until spring or favorable conditions to break dormancy and start putting on a lot more roots and a lot of foliage. So dormant plantings can be done anytime after those killing frosts. So, figure right before Thanksgiving. Anytime from then on until the plant breaks dormancy in the spring and you start to see those first early buds. So if you can still work the soil easily with a shovel, you can still plant. And this, again, you wouldn't be expecting the roots or the foliage or anything. You wouldn't see any changes in the plant this year. You're just setting it up for really good success early next year. Because the idea with a dormant planting is that you're getting the plant in the ground in preparation for spring much earlier than you would just logistically be able to get that plant in the ground next spring. So it's just a good strategy that'll make things a lot easier on you. Plus, you can often find plants that are on sale or a little bit cheaper for a dormant planting than in early spring when everybody is stocking the nurseries wanting everything before Mother's Day. So, all right, so just a brief note on what is dormancy. I mentioned that it is, you could think of it as kind of like plant hibernation. So dormancy is a period of arrested plant growth when they go through this process of preparing their soft tissues for freezing temperatures. As we all know, water expands when it freezes into ice. So if all of the cells in a plant have a lot of water in them, or the plant itself has water in it, when it freezes, it would expand. This is what happened to all my tomatoes earlier this week, unfortunately. They had not gone into dormancy, obviously. So when a plant goes into dormancy, it takes all of those sugars and those carbohydrates that it diligently produced all summer long, and it transports them down into the root system for winter. And the plant is not dead, it's surviving off of those sugars and carbohydrates, but it is transporting all of those things efficiently down for the winter. This is also part of what we see as the leaves start to change color. A lot of those sugars and carbohydrates are being pulled from the leaves, and then subsequently the chlorophyll is pulled from the leaf. That's the green part. And when that chlorophyll is pulled from the leaf, it leaves behind those beautiful orange and red hues that we love. So that's why, quick note on why leaves change color. Now this process of dormancy is triggered by both day length and the temperature. So while a lot of this does have to do with weather, we've both mentioned that several times. You want to know your frost date, things like that. It also has to do with day length. So even if we have a really warm fall one year, we would still expect to see plants going dormant at the predicted time, because our day length is going to continue to change regardless of what our weather does. So you can start looking at the plants, and when the leaves start going brown, you can see that they're beginning to go into dormancy. And then when the stems seem quite dry and hard and there's generally no leaves left, you would expect the plant to be fully dormant. So as far as timing, like I mentioned, we've got the two different strategies where you've got either an actively growing plant that you're putting in late in the season and setting it up to put on a lot of root growth and establish those roots really strong this year. Or you've got your dormant planting where the plant is fully dormant and you're simply using it as a strategy to get it in the ground early so that it can break dormancy really early and get a head start next spring. So if you're doing a late season planting and your plant is still actively growing, you can plant it anytime now through probably about mid-October. A great rule of thumb is to plant everything before Columbus Day. Now, if you have a dormant plant, like I mentioned already, after the plant is fully dormant, you can put it in the ground anytime up until it breaks dormancy, as long as you can comfortably work the soil. Obviously, you don't want to go out to the soil with a pickaxe and be trying to hack away at some ice to try to get a plant in the ground, because you'll likely end up damaging the plant in that process. So just make sure that the soil is actually still workable. And this is based on weather. You probably also don't want to be going out in the middle of February and having to get your snowblower out to try to put something in the ground. So just to think through those logistics, but you can use either strategy. If you purchase a plant or you have a plant that you want to get in the ground and you miss your window for late season planting, there is a strategy called healing in that you can use to sort of carry over a plant until it's fully dormant and then plant it as a dormant plant. It's not the best for a plant, but it is something where if you're getting really close to that Columbus Day window, mid-October, and you're looking at the weather and the weather's not supposed to be great, what you can do is take the plant and a wheelbarrow of dirt, or maybe a bucket of dirt, something like that, and basically lay it over in the wheelbarrow or the bucket and cover the roots with soil. Keep the soil just slightly moist and keep that plant in the shade. So a good spot would probably be in the garage. And what you're hoping to do is basically carry that plant over and keep it alive until it goes fully dormant. Then you can use a dormant planting strategy with that same plant. So again, that's not the best strategy. Ideally, you'll have any live plants in the ground with roots established before the soil temperature gets below about 40 degrees. So we do have a window where you probably shouldn't plant anything, which is generally mid-October until mid-November. That's kind of that dangerous window where if it's still alive and hasn't gone dormant yet, it could get killed by a killing frost. So don't plant in that short window there. All right, now some tips for a late season planting. Don't forget to water it. Just because it's getting a little bit cooler at night and most of your petunias have probably died off, doesn't mean that you don't have to water trees and shrubs that you have planted. Water is crucial for their root establishment. So make sure that you're aiming for frequent waterings of a short duration. It's always better to water more frequently and for shorter periods than it is to do something like drag a hose out there once a week for 5 hours. Remember that your soil can only hold so much water, and any excess water is wasting water, and it's water that's not available to that plant. So after you've first planted something, regardless of whether you're doing a fall planting or a spring planting or anything else, when you first planted something, try to water it every day for at least 10 to 15 minutes. Now, for a fall planting, you can taper that off as we get closer to fall. So as the weather starts to cool down, you can maybe transition from watering every single day to watering every other day to maybe just once or twice a week. And eventually you can stop watering it once the ground is freezing. An important note here is that moist soil doesn't freeze and thaw as quickly as dry soil does. So one of the concerns we have with planting in the fall is that you might get frost heaves. So a good strategy or a good tip for preventing frost heaves, which can damage your plant, is to keep that soil lightly moist. This will basically prevent that rapid expansion and contraction, which can damage the roots. All right, now this one is pretty easy. As far as fertilizer goes, don't use it. So fertilizer is generally used to encourage a lot of foliage growth, and in a fall planting for a late season plant where your plant is still alive, we are not trying to encourage foliage growth. We're trying to encourage root growth. That's the point of this whole thing. So if you've done a soil sample and you know that your soil is a little on the poor side and you want to do some soil amendments, or you want to add a few nutrients or things that your soil might be shy on, go ahead and wait until the spring to do that. But again, I really encourage you to test your soil. I personally believe that people put down too much fertilizer as a general rule. So soil tests are pretty easy. And if you want to know more about soil health and how to do a soil test, we did a full workshop on that. Samantha taught that one, and it was a really great workshop. You can check the link out to that on our website, or you can call us and get more information. But as far as fall plantings go, you can just forget about fertilizer. We don't need it here. What we do need is mulch. Absolutely don't forget your mulch around any kind of plantings that you're doing in the fall. So mulch will help you to maintain your soil moisture. Again, this will help prevent that rapid freezing and thawing that we'll have in the fall, which can cause frost heaves and damage your soil. Or damage your roots, excuse me. Mulch will also help moderate the soil temperature. Again, this prevents the freezing and thawing and those frost heaves, but it will also just keep your soil slightly warmer so that you can maintain that soil above temperature where you're still producing lots of root growth. We recommend that you use about 3 to 4 inches of mulch around each individual planting. We did a workshop a couple weeks ago where we talked about gardening for water conservation, and I referred to mulch as any substrate that you put around your plant. But for these purposes, I'm going to be specifically talking about a wood mulch because it does a little bit better of job of moderating that soil temperature. So use a wood mulch. Use about 3 to 4 inches of it around each individual plant, but absolutely make sure to make a donut with your mulch around that plant. Do not heap it up around the stem of your tree like a volcano. That can lead to some diseases and some rot, and that area of a tree or a plant just above soil line is pretty sensitive, and you don't want to be planting something too deep or to be piling mulch up around the base of the plant. So make kind of the donut around and leave a little bit of space right around the trunk for that trunk to not be too wet. Okay, so if you're interested in getting some seedlings, whether they're trees or shrubs, I would really recommend checking out our conservation seedling program. So this program is accepting orders September 14th through February 28th. And I believe Michaela just put a link in the chat box to our website for this. This program is first come, first serve for available plants. And we need to make a note here that this is for conservation practices only. It's not for landscaping. And so what we mean by that is that we've developed a partnership with the DNRC Conservation Nursery out of Missoula. And through them, we can offer Flathead County residents a really good deal on top quality seedlings. But if you want to take advantage of this, you have to buy in bulk. So this program is not designed for someone to buy one tree to put in their front yard as a landscaping feature. This program is designed for reforestation, for creating wildlife or pollinator habitat, for planting a hedgerow or a privacy berm. Any of those types of practices are applicable under this program. Now, when I say you have to buy in bulk, it's one of those where the smaller the plant, the bigger your order. The bigger the plant, the smaller your order. So if you want a true seedling that is fairly small in size, because maybe you're trying to reforest several acres and you want to get 200 of them, you can get a 1 or 2 year old seedling that is only a few inches tall, like the one pictured here on the slide. And those are going to be at a really great cost to you, but you're going to have to buy them in a large bulk. Now, if maybe you don't want quite that many of one thing, or maybe you want a few of several different species, you can take advantage of this program and get larger plants that are maybe several feet tall and come in smaller lot sizes. I think the smallest lot size is 8. So we have people use this for things like Carragana, for example, if you want to plant a hedgerow, that's a really hardy, deer-resistant species. That one's not a native, but it does provide some good habitat, and we do encourage that one because it's so hardy for hedgerows and windbreaks. We'll have people buy different lots of that, just as an example. So if you're interested in that program, like I mentioned, it's first come, first serve. So check out the website and get a hold of us to get your application in. With that, man, I feel like I just breezed through everything. That was quick. We'll go ahead and take questions. And I will
Thanks so much,
stop sharing.
Samantha. Perfect. So we do have one question in the chat box we'll start with, but just for everyone, if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat box or down below you will see participants. Click on that and there is a little button that says raise hand, and from there you can unmute yourself and ask a question. So a few different ways to ask a question if you have any. So the first question that we have is, how do you know if a seed has high dormancy? And I believe that was during your presentations part, Samantha.
Yeah, that's a good question. So many factors influence dormancy in seed. I guess I would say, generally, if you select native perennial species, you can assume that they're going to have pretty high dormancy when they go to seed, or when they're planted from seed. And they're adapted to growing in this climate. So, they're used to and adapted to the environmental conditions and pressures. If you're interested in finding out for a specific kind of seed or a plant, I guess I would say contact like a local nursery and ask them about it, let them know what you're interested in, or maybe contact whoever you're interested in purchasing the seed from and tell them what your intentions are for timing of seeding and get their recommendations on how well it would do. But I don't think you'll find, anything on like a seed packet that's like this specific dormancy rate for seeds. But Haley, you might know some additional info. Feel free to chime in.
No, the only other thing that I could recommend is to Google individual plants. I haven't seen a resource out there anywhere that has like an exhaustive list of plants and what their seed dormancy is. But I have found when I've been looking for something for a really specific plant, I've generally been able to find the information just on Google. So there's some good resources out there.
Same with when you are looking for containerized plants that are dormant, do you normally find that does that normally happen at nurseries where they'll have plants that are dormant for you to plant later in the season?
Well, I think most of our nurseries around here tend to close down in the wintertime. You know, there's not a lot of folks walking around in November looking to plant something. So unfortunately, no, I don't think that we have a ton of opportunity to purchase dormant plants. But as we get on towards fall, some plants are going to go dormant earlier than others. And then sometimes too, I think what's a little bit more common is when nurseries open up in early spring, some plants have yet to break dormancy. So remember, with a dormant planting, you can plant anywhere all the way until about April or so when plants start to break dormancy. So if you go to the nursery and you see some that really look like just sticks still, ask the nursery staff, make sure it's not dead. Make sure that it's just a plant that's still dormant, and then that's a good strategy for getting it in the ground, and that would be just really early spring.
Great. Do we have any more questions at all this time? We have a few thank yous coming in the chat box. I'll take this moment while people are still thinking of questions to just remind you of our survey. I'll post it in the chat box. Please take a few moments to fill it out. Put that there, but in the meantime, still please keep asking questions. All right, we had one that just came through. How do you know when to stop watering?
I would say that you can stop watering once, I mean, if your plant has already gone dormant, for example, you can stop watering it. Alternatively, if it's getting so cold out that the water is freezing in your hose, you can definitely stop watering. It's that tricky window in the middle where we've got cooler temperatures, but your plant is still probably putting on root growth and it's not showing a lot up top. That can be a little bit trickier. I don't think that there's going to be a whole lot of harm in watering too late in the season. If your plant has already gone dormant, it's just not going to take up or take advantage of that water. So I would recommend erring on the side of caution and watering slightly later into the season than you would expect. Obviously, if winter is setting in and the soil is freezing, then you shouldn't need to.
Great, thanks, Haley. We had another question that just came in. Do pollinators still use stalks that have been cut and put into a compost pile?
Great question. I would say that it kind of depends on the status of your compost pile. If it truly is just a pile set aside somewhere, they probably would. But keep in mind, a lot of our pollinators are already starting to lay eggs in those stems. So if you cut the plant, say in a week or two when you're cleaning up your garden, and then you move it to the brush pile, you've probably moved eggs or larvae that is in that stem already, and it may not do as well in its new spot. So that's why we encourage folks to leave the stems standing if you can. But if you are cleaning up stuff and you have a compost pile, it may very well be made use of just as is, just as a brush pile. So yeah.
Great. Do we have any more questions? You're more than welcome to unmute yourself to ask a question as well, if you don't want to post in the chat box.
Hey, Michaela, did you share that publication from the Xerces Society about nesting and overwintering habitat? I think I forgot to mention it during my presentation.
Yes, I
There's
did.
Perfect. So that's a really good publication. It talks a lot about different strategies for that. So
Yes, and for everyone listening, all these resources, like I said, you can download them right on your computer, but they'll also be available on our website when we post the recording of this webinar as well. All right, we have another question on how do we attract bats?
Good one. With No, bats are generally found in areas where there is water, because that's what a lot of their food source is for. So if you live in an area that's pretty far in from a source of open water, it may be difficult to attract plants to your house. But if you've got water nearby and you know you've got a food source because the mosquitoes eat you like crazy every evening, one of the things that you can do is build bat boxes. And I don't have any of the publications handy to share with you right now, but I know that there are some really great resources online. I believe Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks even has a publication on how to build bat boxes with recommendations on where to put them. Because bats are a little bit like bees in that way, where they need nesting habitat as well as rearing habitat for their young and overwintering habitat. Not all of our bats are migratory. So you can check out some of those resources through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. That'd be my best recommendation.
And Haley, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe all of our bat species here in Montana are not pollinators, right? So there's not necessarily like a species of plant you could include in your pollinator garden or something like that to attract bats like they are in the Southwest.
Right. So we do generally consider bats as a pollinator, but because most of our bats are insectivores and they're not hopping from plant to plant to plant, they're not functioning in the same way that some of those frugivore bats are that are doing that. So you're right, Samantha. Most of our bats are not pollinators. But one thing you can do where the habitat and there's going to be overlap is those snags, like we're in the picture on the PowerPoint of that old tree that had all those woodpecker holes in it. Those holes can be made use of by both our native bee pollinators as well as a lot of our bats are cavity nesters. So those big old standing dead snag trees are really beneficial. And if you happen to have one of those on your property, leave it.
I think that kind of leads into our next question too of do bees need a hive?
Yeah, so Samantha, you can fill in if anything, if there's anything that you can think of, but in general, it depends on the species. So some of our bees are what we consider colony nesters, and they will have a hive that they go to. A lot of the hive boxes that you see brought in for the cherry blossoms, things like that. Those are not our native bees. That's the traditional bee box that we think of. But a lot of our natives, or some of our natives, will go to a hive. Some of our native bees are solitary bees, and they have a much different strategy where they will individually lay their eggs, and their larvae will be in like the hollow pith of those stems kind of lined up. So there's sort of two different strategies that our native bees use. Samantha, anything to add?
No, I mean, that covers the basics of what I was thinking. I just thought also of those mason bee houses, you know, which is not necessarily like a hive per se, but it is some kind of like structural habitat you can provide to attract our native and sometimes solitary species to like a structure. but they're not necessarily for colony living.
Right. So you're talking about those like the bee condos that you see folks making, right? Yeah. So those are a structure where you'll have multiple bees in them, but you'll have probably one bee that is laying eggs in each of the different ones. So they're not interacting as a big colony or a hive like you see in those bigger commercial bee boxes for the bees that nest elsewhere. So yeah, that's kind of a mixed strategy, I guess.
Great. Do we have any more questions at all? I will take this time to post that survey in one more time in the chat box if everyone has a few moments to fill it out. Samantha, I have a question for you. For folks who might be interested in the Pollinator Initiative this fall, their time limit for obviously getting site prep is a bit limited. So what would you recommend the best approach if people are interested in seeding this fall through our Pollinator Initiative program?
Yeah, so through the Pollinator Initiative Program, I mean, even if you don't get your seed down like, right away, if the conditions allow, you can do the site prep this fall. Solarization is not going to be an option for you because that takes much longer and you need those hot periods that we are now clearly out of here in Northwest Montana. But if you had the ability to go ahead and get started on the site prep ASAP, you could do a combination of tillage and chemical treatment or tillage only and still have time to do a dormant seeding this fall. So you don't, again, expect any germination to take place this fall, but you could certainly still prep the site and get that seed down before we get a lot of snow cover.
Great, thanks, Samantha. Do we have any more questions at all? Again, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask as appropriate. It'd be great. Haley and Samantha both mentioned some of our previous webinars as well. I'm going to share a link that you can access them on our website. And so this is a great thing if there's anything that they briefly mentioned that you want to know more about, such as soil health or just creating pollinator habitat in general, as well as gardening for water conservation. There's some great resources there, and we go a little bit more in depth in some of these topics. So I'll share that link too for anyone interested in those webinars. Perfect. Well, if we don't have any more questions at the time, I would just highly recommend that you fill out our survey for us. Just thank you all so much for attending. And if you have any more questions regarding how to prepare pollinator habitat in the fall, please don't hesitate to reach out to the district. You can reach us at our office here. We also have our website, which has a lot of great resources. We also have our demonstration garden where a lot of the plants are still doing really well. Our sunflowers didn't get quite taken up by that frost, which is great. So if you want to come and see an example of what a fall seeding can look like next summer, please feel free to stop by our demonstration garden. We're just here off Highway 2 in Kalispell. Wow. Well, I will post the survey one more time, and if you have any more last-minute questions, feel free to ask them.